It's hard to overstate the impact that Banjo-Kazooie had on those who grew up in the Nintendo 64 era. As one of the premier video game IPs to come out of the late 90s, it quickly became Rare's signature franchise and helped define and codify the 3D Collectathon alongside games like Super Mario 64 and Spyro the Dragon. It was such a major success that even when the company shifted focus to other projects following their purchase by Microsoft, the hype around the franchise continued and fan demand for a new game was still high. But with several Banjo developers leaving the company in the years after the series' last game, Nuts and Bolts, where could the series go from here? The answer lay in a spiritual successor. A team of former Rare employees created a new game that took heavy inspiration from the Banjo games, and not long after, another game that shifted the gameplay back to 2D platforming in an effort to shake things up. And while both games were successful commercially, the big questions are, do they live up to the series they spawned from, and are they worth playing in their own right? And today we're gonna answer those questions. This is Yooka-Laylee. In 2014, a group of former Rare developers founded Playtonic Games, a studio in the United Kingdom whose immediate goal was to launch a spiritual successor to the Banjo-Kazooie series. The team previously attempted to get a Banjo-like project off the ground through the Minji Jongo Twitter in 2012, though according to Banjo composer Grant Kirkhope, this version of the game didn't get far. Playtonic's initial team of 6 consisted of project director Chris Sutherland, managing director Gavin Price, character art director Steve Males, environment art director Stephen Hurst, technical art director Mark Stevenson, and technical director Jens Restemeyer. These 6 began work on Project Yooka-Laylee, a name that continued the musical theme for the game's title and main characters' names, who would go through a few designs before Steve Males eventually settled on a chameleon named Yuka and a bat named Laylee. Playtonic could make the worlds bigger and more expansive than was possible in the days of Banjo thanks to improvements in 3D game development that had propped up since the Nintendo 64 days. The company launched a Kickstarter campaign for the game, now titled Yooka-Laylee, in May 2015 with an initial funding goal of £175,000 to help fulfill their goal of a multi-platform release and account for business costs. And to say this campaign worked would be a huge understatement. Not only was the initial goal fully met within just 38 minutes, but Yooka-Laylee became the fastest Kickstarter game to reach $1 million, which indicates how excited fans were to head back into a Banjo game even if it was under a different banner. Following the Kickstarter, Playtonic partnered with Team 17 to publish the game, and in the coming months, Playtonic employed more staff to help the game come together, including several more former Rare employees. Yooka-Laylee would later launch for PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 on April 11, 2017, with a Nintendo Switch version launching in December and a Wii U release planned but ultimately cancelled. The game was commercially successful, selling over 1 million copies by November 2018, but opinions from both critics and players were wildly mixed, with scores and reviews all across the board. Most agreed that Playtonic delivered exactly what they set out to make, a modern revival of the Banjo-Kazooie formula, but whether or not that translated to an enjoyable title was different for everyone. To this day, Yooka-Laylee continues to be hotly debated as to how good it is as a spiritual successor to Banjo, and if the blueprint of that series can still produce quality titles. So let's see if Playtonic's attempt to bring the Banjo magic back was worth the effort. Yooka-Laylee begins with the evil business tycoon, Capital B, the owner of Hivory Towers, and his assistant, Dr. Quack, searching for the One Book, an artifact with the power to rewrite the world. That book happens to be in the possession of Yuka and Laylee, 2 friends hanging out at their home in Shipwreck Creek. But when Capital B's giant vacuum machine sucks away the One Book, the 2 head out to stop Capital B by invading Hivory Towers and freeing the book worlds within from his influence. The gameplay continues many Banjo traditions, evident not just from the premise of controlling 2 characters as one being, but also the manner in which the platforming serves the progression and design. The crux of the game is collecting objects, either via completing tasks or just finding them out in the open, and the gameplay is centered around abilities that enhance your mobility or allow you to solve specific puzzles. I've previously talked about my preference for moves that grant additional movement or exploration options, rather than just letting you interact with certain objects, and on that front, Yooka-Laylee's moves are fairly lacking. Techniques like the reptile roll, the buddy slam, the glide, and the lizard leap are fun because they give you options for getting around areas or attacking enemies, but moves like the sonar shot, the lizard lash, and the camo cloak have little practical use outside of areas where they're required. I understand it's difficult to create a moveset where every ability adds a new layer to the gameplay, and I commend Playtonic for designing moves that tie into the idea of the main characters being a chameleon and bat. But it doesn't make the moves any less lackluster in both controls and function, although I appreciate how, for the most part, the moves aren't just copies of those found in Kazooie and Tooie. As for how the game plays, it's fine for the most part. One of the most common criticisms when Yooka-Laylee came out was how antiquated and archaic the controls felt, especially for those who weren't familiar with the gameplay of the Banjo games. I found the movement to be pretty okay, with the exception of factors like turning and momentum, which feel stiffer than they should be. The camera is certainly not cooperative, sometimes getting stuck on objects and being sluggish overall, and while it does try to swivel around Yuka and Laylee to give you a better perspective, it isn't a perfect system. Camera movement has always been a pain in 3D platformers, and it's a cliche by now to talk about how bad they are. Yooka-Laylee's camera is better than those in early 3D games, but only marginally, and for a game released in 2017, I can imagine those not used to old school cameras had much more of a problem adjusting to it here. There is another camera mode that fixes the angle unless you manually move it, but I find this style worse because of how slow the point of view takes to move, though I suspect it's the better option for most. It should be noted that Playtonic released updates that address some of the criticisms at launch, and I've only played the game after they were applied, so I can't speak for how the game felt when it was released, but as of now, the game controls decently enough. The core gameplay cycle is running around worlds and grabbing a number of items spread about, essentially Banjo with a different coat of paint. Just about every main collectible in this game has some kind of direct analog to those in the Banjo games, sometimes with a new spin on them to help them stand out, but not enough to make them unique. Pages and Quills fill the exact same role as Jiggies and Notes, and Mollycools allow Yuka and Laylee to activate transformations just like the Mumbo tokens in Kazooie and Globos in Tooie. The Ghost Riders act similarly to Jinjos, but a detail I like is how they all require different tactics to capture rather than just running into them, a nice touch that makes them at least a little more interesting than just waiting around for you to grab them. The only thing that's wholeheartedly new this time are the tonics that alter gameplay to provide a minor boost to your abilities. I don't find them that useful, however, since you can only equip one at a time, and for most of them, the change it makes is minor at best. The gameplay certainly captures the Banjo style even if it isn't as enjoyable, and that goes the same for the visuals and sound, which directly emulate Banjo-Kazooie with updated fidelity to give it a more modern look. Levels are typically bright and colorful with a lighter color palette that creates the same cartoonish atmosphere that the originals did. Just like Banjo-Kazooie, each world has its own distinct look and feel that helps distinguish them from each other, establishing their own mood that feeds into the story, if you will, of each location. That's something that plenty of platformers have done beforehand to make the game feel like a grander adventure, and although the levels themselves are not very good, the principle of a large-scale journey is still engrossing. Perhaps these graphics look simple to many of you, but I believe that's the perfect art direction for a game like this. I'm not expecting anything flashy, just a vibrant world that provides a fun and wacky environment to explore. And hey, the 64-bit Tonic, released as a free update, even lets you play the game in a pseudo N64 style, complete with altered character and level models, a lower frame rate, and built-in scan lines. It's a little weird seeing them juxtaposed with the unchanged UI, but it is a nice little bonus regardless. But while the visuals are certainly on par, I can't say the same for the sound design, as it's way too subdued, even for a simple platformer. In the Banjo games, sounds for hits, footsteps, and abilities had a weight to them that made these actions fun to listen to as well as perform. It's a nitpick, but seeing as how Banjo's sound design is ingrained in my head, I can't help but notice that Yooka-Laylee's is lacking by comparison. Nothing has the proper impact, with too many sound effects being too quiet or too soft compared to everything else, and it's missing that oomph that delivers a satisfying punch. And I'm sad to say that this applies to the music as well, as I wasn't impressed with the soundtrack by Grant Kirkhope. His work on the Banjo games is legendary, but the melodies here just aren't very memorable, even if they hit the tone you'd expect. It may be personal taste, though it's something I can't help but be disappointed by, even if there are a small handful of standout tracks. Weirdly, I think the use of real instruments ultimately detracts from these pieces instead of benefiting them, possibly because the imperfections of playing live music don't serve this style in the same way that precisely manufactured synthesized tunes do. Perhaps if they were rendered in the N64 sound font, I'd be more accepting of them, but that's obviously not a realistic expectation. One of the areas where Yooka-Laylee really falls flat is the level design, especially if you compare it to the worlds of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. There's a lot of factors that go into why these stages don't work, ranging from minor to major problems that all add up to the levels falling apart. For one, the worlds are, on the whole, way too expansive with no reason to justify their size. A large portion of each world is wide open space that may have collectibles here and there, but is otherwise vast and hollow. That makes exploring these levels more irritating because after you've done your initial survey and are going around clearing out the tasks you missed, you're doing a lot of walking around through empty spaces. This was a problem with some levels in Banjo-Tooie as well, and as some of you know, I love that game to death, so why doesn't it work here? The answer is simple: landmarks and terrain. Much of the empty space in Yooka-Laylee's levels is flat and lifeless, with barren geometry that isn't exciting to look at nor traverse through. Some levels fare better in this regard, but seeing as how there are only 6 worlds if you count the hub world, the designers focus too much on making each world seem huge and epic without proper attention given to how much space was really necessary. When you first open a world, some challenges aren't available until you expand the world, which opens up previously hidden or locked off areas. This strikes me as odd as it doesn't change the level besides adding new objectives, which doesn't make the levels more interesting to explore, it just haphazardly piles on new content. The act of leaving and re-entering a world is such a distinct visual trigger that tells your brain that you're moving on to a new part of the game, so if you're just turning around and popping right back in, it throws you for a loop. That's why I recommend expanding levels right away if possible, so you can get the full experience without having to leave and come back. Not that it makes the levels better, because again, the level construction just doesn't work here. It's not just how large these stages are, but also how easy it is to just break some of these places when you have the right abilities. Especially around the second or third world where you gain more freedom and mobility, it's very easy to circumnavigate obstacles and pathways by knowing the right places to go. When the terrain is rougher, such as with rocky cliffs and crevices that Yooka can stand on, it usually gives you the right position to take shortcuts. And I don't feel like this is intentionally giving the player an option to solve things another way, but more things just missed in playtesting. I don't mean to give the designers too much flack, but it's something I couldn't help but pick apart here, especially when I'm comparing them, subconsciously or otherwise, to the levels in Kazooie and Tooie. These worlds are designed to capture the feeling of the old Banjo levels, but often I find that they never quite get there. That starts right from the hub world Hivory Towers, perhaps the textbook definition of bland and uninspired. If you watched my Banjo-Kazooie video, you know I don't like Grunty's Lair because of how it's laid out linearly with only a few shortcuts to make backtracking easier, and Hivory Towers works the exact same way. Only this time, the design of each area within the hub world is nowhere near as interesting, with barely any memorable landmarks to help you identify where you are or what you're looking at. The first world, Tribal Stack Tropics, features wide open grassy fields mixed with ancient temples and structures that give it a bit of a prehistoric feel to it. It's not the worst level in the game, but it doesn't make a particularly strong first impression, either a bad one or a good one. It also feels like a very safe level, with no real surprises in terms of the theme or design to help make the game immediately stand out. Again, there aren't any interesting set pieces to help establish the world's identity, making the whole world seem very flat, which isn't the greatest way to begin an adventure. It gets even worse with the next world, Glitter Glaze Glacier, which suffers from having way too much space without enough stuff inside to make it worth the size. So much of this world is full of nothing. Most of it is either empty snowy plains or a large pool of water that seems to stretch on forever, with only a small percentage of areas holding any collectibles. That's because a big chunk of this level takes place in the Isometric Palace, a series of rooms that force the camera into an isometric position. There's absolutely nothing enjoyable about this place. There's too many rooms with no way to tell which entrance leads to where, the camera isn't the best at communicating where you can go, and the grid-based design makes every area look the same. That level left a sour taste in my mouth, and it set a picture in my mind of how the rest of the world would go, which was thankfully broken with the third stage, Moody Maze Marsh, a level I enjoyed quite a bit. While the dark swamp atmosphere isn't the most pleasing to look at, the level layout actually works given Yuka and Laylee's movement capabilities. It still suffers from being too big, but because most of the level consists of smaller areas that connect to each other and actually has easily identifiable landforms, knowing where you are is much easier. Capital Casino, the fourth world, is a great example of a world that sounds really cool on paper, but is very poorly executed. In this level, you collect casino tokens, which you can exchange for pages, a neat idea that ties in perfectly with the theme, and one that I wouldn't mind if the level was constructed well, which it is not. Most of the games and challenges are too simple or repetitive, and as you probably guessed, it's way too large. I should reiterate that I have no problem with a level being big if it has enough content, and these worlds just don't have that. At last we come to Galleon Galaxy, an outer space / pirate themed world that's okay, but nothing spectacular. Just like Moody Maze Marsh, while it is a large area, the places you can travel are more condensed, which gives an impression of a grand scale while keeping things relatively confined, and I like that. But it's brought down by middling objectives and a story that isn't fully developed, though these issues thankfully don't affect the stage too much. All of these levels fall into the same trap that pervades the entirety of Yooka-Laylee. It tries and ultimately fails to copy the Banjo formula rather than creating something new or different. Nostalgia pandering is an apt way to describe it, and it's perhaps one of the primary reasons why it didn't connect with a lot of people. The Banjo games are classics, no doubt about that, but as we see in games that followed it, imitating that style is not a guarantee for success. Designers have to apply some kind of innovation that helps their work stand out from games that came before it, otherwise you run the risk of crumbling under the weight of the expectations of your inspirations. Yooka-Laylee is too wrapped up in reminding the player of moments from Banjo-Kazooie without showing a proper understanding as to why those moments worked in the first place. The elements that comprise Banjo are iconic, but not just because those games have a special place in our hearts, it's because they were designed to create a quirky and unique experience. This game falls back too much on the principles established in Banjo-Kazooie and doesn't dare to evolve beyond the expected tropes. Take the quizzes, for instance, a prime example of how Playtonic failed to translate a part of the Banjo games into a modern environment. These were a great surprise in Kazooie and Tooie because they came right at the end and only blocked a small portion of progression. Dr. Quack's quizzes, on the other hand, are spaced out between 3 areas of the game, bringing the pacing to a halt every time and making it feel more like homework since you're anticipating and dreading it. Yooka-Laylee is at a disadvantage from the get-go because it isn't pioneering anything. It's jumping back into a genre that the industry has largely forgotten about and tethering itself to the works that came before it. In 1998, 3D platformers were still fresh, but they quickly became commonplace or oversaturated depending on your viewpoint, and by 2017, many considered them antiquated. By emulating the Banjo games almost to a T, Yooka-Laylee could never rise above what those titles already provided, and can instead only fall into the same issues that pervaded them. This is the classic failing of many spiritual successors, as no matter how hard they try to do something different than their inspirations, inevitably it has to entice fans of the original titles. The easiest and safest way to do that is through direct callbacks to the works they follow, a tactic used in an attempt to carry the existing audience over that, if done incorrectly, can often disillusion rather than comfort. I don't blame Playtonic for doing this, especially since the collectathon genre basically had all of its lifeblood squeezed out of it by that time, but it means that Yooka-Laylee doesn't work on any front. It doesn't work on its own because of major design problems, and it doesn't work as a Banjo successor because it coddles itself too closely to that series. And really, that's the tragedy of Yooka-Laylee. It's stuck too far in the past to appeal to the audience of today, and lagging too much of the magic of the game it's lifting its core from to appeal to the audience of yesterday. Whenever it's not just frantically copying elements from the Banjo games, it's trying desperately to salvage a genre that many dismissed as dead, and usually failing. It isn't an awful game per se, but it never shines above its influences and doesn't do enough differently to stand out in its own right. And that might all be okay if this was merely inspired by the work of Rare in the late 90s, but this was the Banjo team. Considering many key Playtonic staff members worked on the Banjo games and Rare wasn't, and still isn't, planning on bringing the bear and bird back, the expectations were undoubtedly higher. Perhaps it's unfair to continuously harp on that point, and in hindsight, us as players hailing this as the return of the Banjo formula before the game even launched was a bit presumptuous. In the end, the ultimate legacy of Yooka-Laylee will not be that it's a mediocre 3D collectathon platformer that doesn't add anything to the genre, but rather as the game that tried and failed to revive Banjo, an unflattering endowment for sure. And if Playtonic hadn't continued the series, then Yooka-Laylee would be saddled with that legacy forever. But in 2019, Playtonic came out with a game that would, for some, redeem their new property. Development on a sequel to Yooka-Laylee began not long after the game launched, although it would not continue the first game's 3D gameplay and instead transition the series into 2D. This game, titled Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, took heavy inspiration from the Donkey Kong Country series, another Rare series that many Playtonic developers had previously worked on. This time, however, Playtonic deliberately avoided using the term spiritual successor in their marketing, particularly because they wanted Impossible Lair to shine on its own without any comparison. The similarities are obvious, but people were able to look at Impossible Lair as its own thing rather than an attempt to bring the country games back, likely also because Nintendo already had within the past 10 years. Impossible Lair was announced in June 2019 and released in October, and reviews were overall more positive, with people praising Playtonic for rising above the issues of the previous game. Given this critical recognition, the sequel to Yooka-Laylee has a lot riding on it, so let's see how it stacks up next to its predecessor. Impossible Lair begins with Yuka and Laylee arriving in the Royal Stingdom after being summoned by Queen Phoebe to help her defend against the returning Capital B. This time, Capital B has a device known as the Hive Mind, which allows him to control Queen Phoebe's Legion of Bees, and he hides himself away in the Impossible Lair. Yuka and Laylee chase after him, but assuming you don't get extremely lucky and beat the Impossible Lair on your first run through, the two end up retreating and Queen Phoebe tasks them with freeing the members of the Royal Battalion Guard to give them more chances of surviving the lair. As I mentioned, Impossible Lair transitions away from the Banjo style of 3D platformers and moves into the Donkey Kong Country style of 2D platformers, although that description doesn't fully do it justice. Playtonic trades in the open worlds, discovery of new abilities, and hard emphasis on collecting items for linear stages, a simple moveset that you need to master, and a soft emphasis on collecting items. Movement is a bigger focus, as the gameplay is more frantic and action-packed, with precise timing required to make it past obstacles. Yuka and Laylee retain the spin attack, roll, and buddy slam, but nothing else, meaning you need to learn how to control Yuka and Laylee and guide them to the end while avoiding traps. It's more overtly skill-based as it requires more dexterity on your part, which I think makes the game infinitely more engaging. Despite the shift backwards in dimensions, Impossible Lair is deeper than its predecessor because the game feels more versatile, an example of how sometimes stripping a game down to its essentials creates a more fulfilling experience over stuffing it with extra features. It's perfectly possible to just rush through each level head first and reach the goal, but the explorative types will find plenty of hidden areas containing items like quills or twit coins. Considering you need the former to unlock tonics and the latter to progress through the game, keeping your eyes open for suspicious looking areas and investigating them is still worthwhile. But on the subject of tonics, those are back as well and have a much more important role this time around. Not only can you equip multiple tonics at once now, but they also have a modifier that affects how many quills you receive at the end of a level, with positive tonics giving you less quills and vice versa for those that hurt you. That gives the tonics you put on more importance, as making the game too easy on yourself can lead to situations where there's a tonic you really want to unlock, but you aren't collecting quills fast enough to get it quickly. The critical factor in what makes platformers like these work, of course, is the level design, and Impossible Lair is mostly successful on that front. The influence from Donkey Kong Country is as pronounced here as it is in the gameplay, especially in regards to the overall flow of levels, specific challenge types, and hidden secrets in each stage. To accommodate for the fast-paced gameplay, levels typically aren't too flashy, giving you plenty of room to observe your immediate surroundings and not distracting you with too much on-screen at once. New elements are added gradually, creating an escalating challenge that expects you to show off more skill as you move through the stage. Since levels are broken up into sections divided by checkpoints, the stages often operate in waves, scaling up and down in difficulty constantly through minor adjustments that keep you on your toes, but mostly never step too far into either too easy or too hard territory suddenly. One aspect of these levels I really like is how the levels often incorporate non-traditional platforms into a stage's construction. For example, you might have to travel on top of giant gears in a factory or vines in a forest, among other theme-appropriate objects. This isn't a concept exclusive to Impossible Lair, and even the first Yooka-Laylee did this to some extent, but it does give the worlds a more developed personality informed by the nature of their setting. And due to the linear design, many of these areas unpackage their own little story, in a sense, as the level progresses. The level might become more dangerous, or something in the visuals might change after a certain point. That's accentuated with the level-changing mechanic, where actions in the overworld can transform the stage into an altered version that puts an added twist on the world, such as freezing the level, setting it underwater, making previously stationary platforms move, etc. This is a much better way of making the worlds feel bigger than just having gigantic worlds with nothing to show for them, evidence that Playtonic learned from the mistakes of the first game and corrected them here. I don't mean to keep harping on Yooka-Laylee, but the difference in design quality is night and day, especially after playing the games back to back. But if there's one area I really dislike in this game, it's the overworld. Housing these levels is an expansive hub controlled from a bird's eye view perspective where you're still able to walk around, jump, and attack, but in a manner that's more constrictive and harder to maneuver. I don't typically mind overworlds like this as long as they don't get in the way of moving from level to level, and this one definitely does. Hivory Towers may not have been a good hub world, but at least the gameplay was consistent with the rest of the game, unlike here where the process of exploring to open up new areas of the world is just tedious thanks to the limited mechanics and annoying design. The graphics are of similar quality as the first game, with some more detail in the lighting and shading, but since the game is in 2D, the artist put more attention into drawing in-depth backgrounds, which look really nice. Considering there's a lot more levels this time around, putting in more scenery that helps levels stick out in your mind is critical to keep the game visually stimulating and fresh. The color choices are nice too, giving levels a unique flair while keeping Yooka and Laylee distinct enough so you always know where they are. The sound design is very much improved this time around, as hurting enemies actually has a satisfying sound, and miraculously, I enjoy the soundtrack much more this time. Grant Kirkhope only composed the overworld theme in all its variations this time, which is a nice and jaunty tune, but where the real gems on the soundtrack lie are the level themes. Donkey Kong Country composer David Wise, Yooka-Laylee audio designer Daniel Murdoch, and former TT Games audio designer Matt Griffin all come together to create music that nicely complements these stages. It reminds me a lot of the soundtracks to the Donkey Kong Country Returns games, not just because of David Wise's work, but because it captures the ambience and rhythm the Returns soundtrack showcased. And what I love is that each level has its own style, mood, and tempo, helping the stages establish their own identity alongside the level design. don't know if Impossible Layer's soundtrack ranks with the Return series music, and it certainly doesn't match the Country Trilogy soundtracks, but it's still a good set of tracks, especially compared to the first game's music. But the most interesting thing to me in looking at Impossible Layer, especially in conjunction with its predecessor, is how Playtonic didn't rely too heavily on its influences this time around. While Impossible Layer borrows a lot of concepts from the Country games, it does so in a way that isn't uninspired, instead taking the elements of those games that worked and maintaining the unique stylings of the first title. It is very much the gameplay of the Country games enhanced for a modern audience, but what's curious is how less it reminds me of its inspiration than Yooka-Laylee did. Likely this is because the Banjo type of 3D platformer is so distinct that any attempt to strictly imitate it would come off as distracting, whereas the gameplay of the Country games, while incredibly fun, isn't as one of a kind. The other reason is because, to put it simply, the game is actually good on its own merits, and not just because it's reminiscent of games past. The gameplay, levels, collectibles, and world design of Impossible Layer aren't enjoyable because they're like Donkey Kong Country, they're enjoyable because they're enjoyable. You don't need to play the Country games to appreciate Impossible Layer, and the game has enough mileage to allow it to stand on its own legs. That, to me, is the most impressive part about Impossible Layer, because while I don't think the game is anything outstanding, it's almost unbelievable how much Playtonic took to heart the criticisms of the first game and actually learned from what they did wrong. And it's not just that the design isn't as shoddy, the game has plenty to like about it on a surface level. For example, the game's actually pretty funny. Yooka-Laylee had humor, but most of it was poking fun at itself and referential jokes to the Banjo series, all of which was way too smug and unaware of how ironic those self-deprecating jokes were. But Impossible Layer made me laugh quite a bit, with gags like the gates that you spend coins on being called paywalls, and the box puzzle in the last area that nearly killed me because it was a twist I didn't see coming, and which I don't dare ruin here. And hell, I even like all the bee puns, particularly all those in-jokes. Something as simple as that makes you really appreciate all the good elements of what you're playing, and in my eyes, Impossible Layer is better than Yooka-Laylee in almost every way. The game is far from perfect though, and in some instances it can be just as broken, sometimes even more so, than Yooka-Laylee was. It's not broken so much in the way that Yooka-Laylee's levels were, but more in that sometimes a mechanic or object won't behave correctly. I counted a handful of times where level hazards or enemies wouldn't spawn as intended for seemingly no reason, and that box puzzle I just mentioned glitched out on me once, forcing me to restart the game. For a much less serious, but way more disturbing example, in one level I tried entering a locked door as Yuka spit something out, and his face was frozen in this terrifying mid-chomp animation. So that's pretty fun. Those hiccups aside, Impossible Layer is a competently crafted experience and a definite step up for the Yooka-Laylee franchise. It's by no means amazing, but the gameplay and level design is solid, and its simplicity works heavily in its favor. Really, the fact that Playtonic actually made such a huge upgrade from their initial efforts trumps Impossible Layer's actual quality, and the game actually being good just acts as a sweetener. That's not meant as a put-down, mind you, because I can absolutely recommend Impossible Layer for those looking for a good platformer, and unlike the first game, it will likely be remembered as a quality title. Playtonic initially banked on nostalgia to sell and impress, and though Yooka-Laylee is absolutely nostalgic, it is also barren and monotonous in a way that makes the game seem artificial. It may have been born from a place of passion, but the foundation feels cheaply constructed, as if those former Rare developers were simply caving into fan demand for a Banjo follow-up, and the finished product tried so hard to please fans of the originals that it ended up pleasing nobody. As Impossible Layer proved, there is hope for the Yooka-Laylee series so long as the developers don't tie themselves too much to an anchor in an effort to not distance it from previous titles. But despite that, I don't necessarily think the reason Impossible Layer was a triumph was that it abandoned the classic style of 3D platforming. In the wake of Yooka-Laylee's announcement, several revivals of classic platformers were either revealed or released, such as Insomniac's Ratchet & Clank reboot and the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane trilogy. And with games like Super Mario Odyssey coming from high-profile game developers, it's clear that 3D platformers are not a dying breed. Banjo and Kazooie themselves were added to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate to the delight of fans, showing how much people still love the bear and bird. It highlights that the desire for a new Banjo game is still rampant all these years later, even after Yooka-Laylee burned a lot of people. But will Rare or Playtonic be the one to continue that legacy? Well, I believe that the answer is neither. Playtonic has started a publishing wing called Playtonic Friends, which has released Fabraz's Demon Turf and Aw Interactive's BPM Bullets Per Minute, and will be publishing Okidoki Co.'s A Little Golf Journey. They're still involved in game development, although no new projects have been announced as of this video, and it's still up in the air whether or not the Yuka series will yield another game. As for Rare, they're currently at work on their game Everwild, which, if the reports on development restarting from scratch are true, will occupy them from some time, alongside continued support for Sea of Thieves. Even if they had the time to work on a new Banjo game, which they could do seeing as how they have the rights, considering the direction they've taken in the past couple of years, I doubt they have any interest in doing so. And maybe that's a good thing, because as the first Yooka-Laylee game proved, trying to bring back a beloved formula without taking the proper care to examine it critically is a recipe for disaster. Even the people who like Yooka-Laylee can usually agree that it's nowhere near the quality of the original Banjo games, and it was unable to fill the void that players held in their hearts for decades. The reality is, making a 3D collectathon in this day and age and executing it well is incredibly difficult, and while it's always possible it could be done, I personally would rather look to the future. We should not expect nor demand that Rare, Playtonic, or anyone else attempt to bring Banjo back, because trying to force it to return rather than letting these developers pursue their own path will lead to disappointment. Whether or not Playtonic will keep pushing forward with Yuka and Laylee is unknown for now, but as long as they continue to focus on keeping the games fun and engaging without too much pandering, I'm happy to follow these two on whatever adventures they take.